The wind screamed a frequency only metal could reach. Owen saw the centuries-old oak splinter and the main roof of his own house collapse under the weight of the freezing rain and heavy snow. But what truly horrified him was the quiet stability of Sarah's ridiculous structure next door. Snow, dense and wet, driven horizontally by the blizzard, ripped away the siding of his garage wall. He had spent 3 months laughing at the absurd, heavy-duty double roof Sarah had built, a monstrosity of staggered wood and thick steel beams that looked more like a bunker than a cabin. Now, as the last of his battery-powered lights flickered out, the only beacon of steady, warm light, solid and unshaking against the white fury, was the despised double-roof cabin. Owen pulled his collar higher, the cold already a deep, painful ache in his chest, knowing he had to move or he would be buried. Owen pushed himself away from the broken window frame, the glass shards now completely hidden under drifts of snow inside his living room. His house was a drafty tomb. The thick, custom-built logs of his supposedly rustic high-end cabin were failing catastrophically under the pressure and moisture. He moved slowly, deliberately, his muscles stiff, less from the cold than from years of learned immobility. Owen was a man built to last, wide-shouldered and heavy, but the years since he'd retired, or rather, been pushed out, of the private security contracting world had sanded down his edges, leaving him quiet and perpetually guarded. He walked into the kitchen. The water pipes had burst an hour ago, leaving frozen spray across the stainless steel countertops. The only thing functioning now was the single-burner butane stove he kept for emergencies, casting a weak blue glow. He heated a can of beans, not out of hunger, but because the ritual of preparation gave him something to anchor to. He ate standing up, watching the weather through the one small window that still held its integrity, a porthole into the absolute chaos outside. Owen lived in a state of suspended animation. His house was immaculate, but sterile. No photos on the walls, no personal clutter, just functional, expensive furniture chosen for durability. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. He'd intentionally moved into this remote mountain community for the space, the lack of demands, the ability to disappear into the scenery. But the scenery was turning against him now. He ran a hand over the rough stubble on his jaw. His eyes, usually sharp and assessing, held a dull, distant quality, the look of a man who had seen too much collapse and preferred to manage small, predictable losses than risk any large, sudden attachments. He picked up a leather-bound book from the counter, a worn copy of ancient history, and instead of opening it, he traced the deep groove etched into the spine, right where a child's careless mark had been left years ago, before the departure, before the silence became permanent. He closed his eyes briefly, just long enough for the cold sting of the room to pull him back. He put the book down, precisely where it had been, and began packing a small backpack. He had maybe 20 minutes before the wind shifted and sealed his last exit. He looked at Sarah's house again. It was a defiant, ugly fortress of necessity, holding the line against the storm. The thought of knocking on her door, the woman he'd openly ridiculed for her eccentric construction, tasted like ash in his mouth. Yet, survival was a harsher editor than pride. The 40 yards between their houses was a treacherous landscape of ice and wind-sculpted snowdrifts. Owen moved like a shadow against the white, his heavy coat offering little defense against the wind chill. When he finally reached Sarah's porch, he didn't knock, he pounded, his fist feeling numb against the thick, insulated steel door. The door opened almost immediately, not by Sarah, but by a 9-year-old girl with enormous, serious eyes and a tangle of dark hair. She looked up at Owen, her expression completely devoid of surprise, as if expecting the chaos of the outside world to eventually arrive at her doorstep. "You're freezing," the girl stated, her voice quiet and steady. She didn't move away. Sarah appeared behind her, wiping flour from her hands onto a worn apron. She was mid-40s, tired lines etched around her eyes, but her posture was straight and unfussed. She was stacking thick wooden logs beside a massive cast-iron stove that dominated the small, surprisingly cozy living space. The air inside smelled richly of pine smoke, bread and safety. "Owen?" Sarah said, her voice flat, acknowledging the reality without preamble. There was no "I told you so" in her tone, just quiet observation. She stepped aside, a simple, non-verbal invitation. "Come in. Close the door fully. The seal needs a good push." Owen, still stunned by the sudden drop in temperature and the cessation of the howling wind, obeyed. He felt clumsy, a large intruder in a perfect bubble of warmth. The little girl, whom he knew vaguely as Penny, took his sodden backpack without asking and placed it on the designated drying rack near the stove. "Your boots," Penny instructed, pointing to a mat. Sarah watched the interaction briefly, then returned to her task, methodically checking the pressure gauge on the small water tank and adjusting the damper on the massive stove. These were not emergency measures. This was simply her routine, built into the bones of her eccentric house. She moved with an economy of effort, a kind of practical grace. "There are blankets on the bench," Sarah finally said, looking up. "We're making stew now. You'll need to put your layers near the stove, but don't touch the burner guard." It was command, not plea, and Owen realized she didn't need or expect gratitude. She was simply managing resources and survival with a calm efficiency that was alien to him. He found himself obeying instantly, stripping his outer layer and moving to the bench. He watched Penny, who was now meticulously sorting a pile of dried beans on a cutting board, concentrating fiercely. She wasn't playing or distracting herself, she was contributing. This was a household built on visible, shared labor. It was a kind of strength Owen hadn't realized still existed. Where are you watching this story unfold from? Let me know in the comments. The initial hours were marked by a strict division of labor and minimal conversation. Sarah worked, Penny worked, and Owen sat. His stillness felt heavy, a counterpoint to their quiet, rhythmic movements. The massive double roof and reinforced walls not only blocked the sound of the storm, but seemed to absorb any unnecessary noise inside. Sarah finally spoke, not addressing Owen directly, but talking about the structure itself. The outer roof takes the brunt of the shock and dissipates the moisture away from the internal structure, she explained, tapping the thick log wall. It creates an air pocket, a thermal buffer. Expensive, yes. Absurd, according to the local building codes, also yes, but effective. Owen just nodded, absorbing the data. He was a professional problem solver, and he respected solutions, regardless of their aesthetics. "You're trained," Sarah observed, scooping thick, savory stew into 3 bowls. "I can see it in how you sit, where you put your hands." "Former security contractor," Owen admitted, the title feeling brittle. "I built my house for solitude, not for extreme weather." "Most people do," she replied simply, handing him a bowl and a piece of the homemade bread, still warm. They ate, the clinking of spoons the loudest sound in the room. Penny finished first, then, without instruction, took her bowl and began to wash it in a small basin of recycled water. "We conserve everything," Sarah explained, noticing Owen's glance. "This system is sustainable, but it requires continuous, conscious effort." Owen watched her, seeing the effort, not the strain of the current crisis, but the years of determined planning and execution that had gone into this life. He finally spoke, offering something practical for the first time. "I checked the outer seals when I came in," he said, pointing toward the utility wall. "The gasket near the lower vent is starting to frost over. It will freeze solid soon. It needs petroleum jelly, or it will crack when the temperature drops further." Sarah stopped mid-motion. Her eyes met his, not with gratitude, but with professional assessment. "I don't have enough lubricant left. I used the last of it on the main chimney vent." "I have a tube in my pack," Owen said, pointing to the drying rack. "It's specialty stuff. High thermal tolerance. I can apply it." The small task became their first joint venture. In the confined space of the mudroom, Sarah held a powerful lantern, while Owen, using the tools from his own survival kit, worked quickly on the vent, his large hands surprisingly precise. The action was simple, necessary, and focused. For the first time in years, Owen was performing a useful task that wasn't about guarding a distant interest or managing a threat. He was simply fixing something that needed fixing, for people who needed protection. The shared silence was no longer empty. It was collaborative, a small, fragile safe space built on common need. After securing the vent, Owen returned to his place on the bench, pulling the blanket around himself. He felt the dull ache of muscle fatigue, but underneath it, a thin layer of something unfamiliar, warmth that wasn't strictly physical. Penny, who had been drawing on the floor near the stove, lifted her head. She held up a picture rendered in thick crayons. A house, obviously Sarah's, with exaggerated stacked roofs, standing firm against triangular lines of rain. Beside it, a much smaller, lopsided structure was drawn, listing to one side. "That's your house," Penny declared, pointing to the crooked one. "It's falling down because it's lonely." The blunt assessment hit Owen harder than the storm had. He simply looked at the drawing, unable to formulate a response. Sarah intervened smoothly, though her eyes held a new layer of observation as she looked at Owen. "Penny, we talk about houses, not people," Sarah murmured, a gentle correction that didn't invalidate the child's feeling. "But the house looks like him," Penny insisted, pointing to Owen's stoic face in the drawing. Owen shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't thought about loneliness in concrete terms for decades. He had merely structured his life to avoid the consequences of attachment. But Penny's innocent analogy had cracked a window open. He reached into his backpack, pulling out the ancient history book he'd carried from his collapsing home. He rarely looked at it, but tonight the cold seemed to demand the presence of something familiar. He flipped it open to a random page. The memory was immediate, sharp, and brief, like a sudden intake of frozen air. He was 8 years old, sitting on the steps of a porch, not his own but his uncle's, where he was being temporarily fostered. His mother, an unstable woman chasing a phantom career, had promised to return for him by the end of summer. He had carried this book with him, his most prized possession, the only thing his absent father had ever given him. He remembered the cool evening light and the sound of his uncle's truck pulling away, not returning. A social worker had come the next morning, but the night before, he had sat alone for hours, clinging to the heavy volume, realizing the promise of return was a lie. He had carved the deep groove into the spine of the book with a small, dull knife, an act of silent, desperate control over the only thing he owned. He hadn't cried. Crying hadn't ever been an option. He had simply learned, definitively, that when the storm came, you were always alone. Owen closed the book with a quiet thud, the leather cool under his fingers. He looked at Penny, who was now sketching Sarah's efficient wood stove. The heat was a living thing in this room, something he hadn't had the luxury of relying on in a long, long time. The blizzard didn't abate for 3 full days. The initial desperation of survival gradually dissolved into the rhythm of cohabitation. Owen's cabin was deemed unsalvageable for the duration of the storm, its structure compromised. His new reality was the solid, insulated, often too warm core of Sarah's world. He found his place not by asking, but by observing the needs of the cabin. Sarah needed logs brought in from the covered porch. Owen, with his immense strength, could stack 3 times what she could carry. He monitored the battery levels on the solar array and helped Penny check the rain catchment system, even though it was frozen solid. The routine became sacred. Mornings started with the heavy scent of coffee and the low murmur of the wood fire. Penny would often drag her crayons to the bench where Owen sat, working on her drawings or quietly reading her schoolbooks. She rarely spoke to him directly about emotional things, but she would narrate her observations of the world outside, often confusing the local wildlife with her own imaginary creatures. Owen listened. He didn't offer advice or platitudes. He simply provided a silent, grounded presence. Sarah maintained her practical distance. She never asked about his past, nor did she offer details of her own. She was a single mother, an architect who had applied her trade to her own extreme survival design, and that was all Owen needed to know. Her kindness wasn't soft. It was the kindness of keeping the lights on, the water filtered, and the temperature stable. One afternoon, the flickering radio announced that power restoration was estimated to be weeks away. Sarah sighed, not in defeat, but in recalculation. "I need to ration the stored fuel more aggressively," she murmured, looking at the gauge. "Show me the generator maintenance manual." Owen offered instantly. "We can run a more efficient cycle if I oversee the output during peak usage." She handed him the thick book, a manual he could have written himself years ago. He spent the next 2 hours engrossed, the smell of burnt wood and baking bread filling the small space. Penny brought him a glass of water without being asked, placing it carefully on the edge of the workbench. "You look less lonely now," Penny announced, her chin resting on the table as she watched him read the complex schematics. Owen paused, looking at the child. He hadn't noticed the change. He hadn't noticed that he wasn't perpetually anticipating the next threat or the inevitable abandonment. He was just there, fixed in a necessary orbit around two people who simply existed, demanded nothing, and offered the quiet certainty of belonging. It was a sensation of being anchored, a stability he hadn't known since he was 8 years old and clutching that history book. He realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that this was the longest time he had spent in the company of others without needing to deploy a professional barrier. The fragile peace shattered on the 5th evening. The storm outside had lessened into a manageable freezing drizzle, but the pressure inside the cabin was starting to show. Owen was meticulously organizing the remaining tools, wiping down the metal surfaces against the pervasive condensation. Penny was playing near him with a small carved wooden dog, a relic that sat on a shelf near the fireplace, an object Sarah clearly valued. Penny stumbled, catching herself on Owen's leg. The wooden dog slipped from her grasp and hit the hearthstone with a sharp, sickening crack. The dog's small, pointed ear snapped clean off. Silence descended, heavier than the snow. Penny stared at the broken piece on the floor, her eyes widening with immediate, genuine terror. Sarah entered the room just then, carrying a stack of dry towels. She saw the two of them frozen, the broken artifact on the stone. Her face tightened instantly, the practical calm dissolving into a mask of pure hurt. "Penny, what happened?" Sarah's voice was low, controlled, but edged with an emotion Owen hadn't heard before, a deep, protective grief. Penny burst into tears, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet house. "I didn't mean to. I just tripped." "It's an accident," Owen intervened, his voice instinctively taking on the professional tone of crisis management. "I was organizing the tools. She caught my leg. It was my fault." Sarah shook her head, ignoring Owen and kneeling quickly in front of Penny. "It was a gift, Penny. You know how important that was." "I can fix it," Owen insisted, picking up the two pieces. "I have epoxy. I have clamps. It will be barely visible." Sarah finally looked at him, and the look was cold, accusatory, cutting through his attempts at practical repair. "You don't understand. This isn't a structural repair, Owen. This belonged to my father. He carved it the winter he lost his life, right before the accident." Owen recoiled slightly. He saw the shift in her eyes. He wasn't the useful helper anymore. He was the large, clumsy man who had introduced chaos into her small, carefully curated world of memories. His attempt to fix the object felt, to her, like an erasure of its emotional weight. "I was trying to help," Owen said, his own defenses rising. When he tried to help, he always seemed to break something important. "You don't know how to handle delicate things, Owen," Sarah stated, the words simple and devastating. "You deal in heavy materials and controlled explosions. This requires care, not repair." The implied accusation that he lacked the capacity for true gentleness struck the core of his carefully built isolation. He felt the sting of rejection, the familiar realization that his presence was fundamentally disruptive. He stood up, dropping the broken pieces on the workbench. "I understand," he said, his voice flat, retreating instantly into the silent adult he had been for decades. "I'll be out of your way." He began packing his bag, quickly, efficiently, the cold exterior returning. Penny, still tearful, watched him with wide, confused eyes. Sarah stood motionless, her arms wrapped around herself, not stopping him. The unspoken agreement of the last few days had dissolved into the sharp realization that they were, fundamentally, strangers who had failed to navigate the nuances of shared vulnerability. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. Owen walked out into the lingering cold, the heavy steel door shutting behind him with a decisive final sound. The outside air felt bracing and familiar. The loneliness, too, was a known entity, easier to manage than the complexities of closeness. He settled into the intact section of his garage, relying on the butane stove and his sleeping bag. He would wait out the storm there, managing his own predictable misery. But the image of Penny's stricken face and the profound, silent pain in Sarah's eyes over the small wooden dog refused to dissipate. Sarah hadn't been angry about the object. She had been protective of a memory, and her accusation that he only dealt in heavy materials was a challenge to the very core of his self-imposed rigidity. He spent the night sleeplessly, the temperature dropping critically low. Around 4 a.m., the wind picked up again, not the howling blizzard of before, but a harsh, steady gale. As a man trained to assess risk, Owen knew this was the worst part, the sustained, unrelenting pressure after the initial shock. He looked towards Sarah's cabin. He hadn't just studied her maintenance manual, he'd internalized it. Her primary vulnerability, besides the fuel rationing, was the main access pipe for the well pump. It was deeply buried, but exposed in a short 10-foot segment near the septic field, a necessary weakness in her design. If that pipe froze and fractured, they would lose their water source, and the damage would be catastrophic, requiring heavy machinery the town wouldn't dispatch for weeks. Owen stood up, pulling on his warmest, most resilient gear. He didn't deliberate. He didn't seek permission. This wasn't about seeking forgiveness or proving Sarah wrong. It was about protecting the bubble of warmth he had just been exiled from. It was about recognizing that his skills, the heavy materials he dealt with, could be used for preservation, not just defense. He found his shovel and 2 thick thermal blankets from his supplies. The walk was agonizingly slow through the knee-deep drifts. He found the exposed pipe section and began to dig, moving the packed snow and frozen earth with methodical, agonizing labor. The cold clawed at his exposed skin, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on the rhythm of the shovel and the integrity of the pipe beneath. He dug down 3 feet, exposing the plastic conduit. Then, with practiced care, he wrapped the pipe completely in the thermal blankets and packed the snow tightly around it again, creating a final, insulated barrier. It was crude, exhausting work, but effective. The pipe was now insulated against the extreme low temperatures of the coming hours. When he finished, his entire body was shaking, and the rising sun was just beginning to cast a weak, bruised light over the mountains. He paused, looking at Sarah's reinforced roof, now clearly defined against the grey sky. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't called out. He simply walked back to his freezing garage, leaving no evidence of his action except for the fresh pattern of shoveling over the exposed ground. He had made a choice to protect what he valued, silently and entirely for their benefit. By mid-morning, the biting cold had chased Owen from the unheated garage. He knew his body couldn't withstand another day without sustained warmth. He moved hesitantly back toward Sarah's cabin, feeling the weight of his previous exit. He knocked softly this time, less a demand and more a quiet request. Sarah opened the door. She looked more tired than before, but her gaze was steady, searching. She didn't offer an apology, nor did she issue a renewed invitation. She simply stepped aside. "You're freezing again," she stated, echoing Penny's words from days ago. Owen entered, stamping the snow from his boots. The cabin was warmer than he remembered. He saw the wooden dog immediately on the mantelpiece, its pieces carefully aligned, held together by a thin, nearly invisible seam of adhesive. Sarah had fixed it herself. "The main well pump is holding pressure," Sarah said abruptly, her eyes fixed on the stovetop. "I checked the gauge this morning. It usually dips heavily in this kind of temperature, but it was solid." Owen simply nodded, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't elaborate, didn't claim credit. "The ground around the septic field is churned up," she continued, her voice low. "It looks like someone was digging heavily, right over the access pipe." The silence stretched, charged with the acknowledgement of his risk and his intention. He hadn't just secured the pipe, he had defended her future supply, the critical backbone of her self-sufficiency. "I know what that pipe means," Owen murmured. "It's the weakest point. I secured it." Sarah didn't say thank you. She walked over to the hearth and picked up the now-repaired wooden dog, turning it over in her hands. "My father died in a construction accident. He was trying to fix something his partner had built poorly. He always believed in taking the time to build things right, even if they looked ugly." She placed the dog back gently. "I was wrong. I thought you saw every problem as a thing to be overpowered. I didn't see you saw it as a thing to be protected." Before Owen could find words, his mind still grappling with her revelation, Penny appeared from the back room, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She stopped when she saw Owen, her initial hesitation replaced by a simple, genuine smile. She walked straight to him and, without a word, reached out and took his large, cold hand. She led him to the bench, the gesture completely unself-conscious. "The house needed you to come back," Penny announced, looking up at him with those serious, truthful eyes. "It got too quiet again when you left, too loose." She didn't mean his house or Sarah's. She meant the quiet, collaborative structure they had built together. Owen looked down at his hand, still enclosed in Penny's small, warm grip. The cold receded completely. He realized that this was the truest definition of being useful he had ever known. The storm finally passed entirely that afternoon, leaving behind a world encased in brilliant, silent ice. The sun, sharp and low, streamed through the small, well-sealed windows of the cabin, making the dust motes dance in the warm air. Owen was sitting near the stove, his damp coat fully dry. He wasn't on the bench anymore, but at the small, communal dining table. He was reading, not his ancient history book, but a manual on sustainable power grids that Sarah kept in the cabinet. He was studying the architecture of survival, not the architecture of war. Sarah moved around the kitchen, her steps light and efficient, preparing dinner. The atmosphere was restored, but deepened, the superficial politeness replaced by a tacit understanding of mutual necessity and shared vulnerability. Penny, seated across from Owen, was cutting out paper snowflakes, completely engrossed. "We will need to move some of the remaining supplies to the utility shed before the thaw," Sarah mentioned, pouring him a fresh cup of coffee. "The path is going to be treacherous when the ice starts to break up." "I can start mapping the routes now," Owen offered. "We should also check the strain on the exterior supports. A week of this wind might have loosened some bolts." It was simple, operational talk, but woven into the planning was a commitment that transcended logistics. They were planning a future together, not as lovers or friends, but as necessary components of a functioning system. Penny finished her paper snowflake and held it up. A perfect, intricate design. "It's strong now," she announced, not looking at the paper but at Owen, "like a double roof, one part to protect the other part." Sarah placed the steaming pot of soup onto the table. She looked at Owen, then at Penny, and finally at the repaired wooden dog on the mantelpiece. The structure of her life, her cabin, her routine, her safety, had always been about building layers of protection. She understood now that protection wasn't just physical material. It was the persistent, deliberate choice to remain, to contribute, and to hold the space open for someone else. "Dinner," Sarah said, the word a gentle invitation. Owen put the manual down. He reached across the table and took a piece of the homemade bread Sarah offered. The simple weight of the loaf in his hand felt more grounding than any contract he had ever signed. He realized that the mockery of the neighbors hadn't been about her eccentric roof. It had been about their collective discomfort with her unshakable independence. Now, standing firm against the harsh winter, her cabin was not merely a house built for survival. It was a home built to hold the people who chose to stay. The only definition of family that mattered was the one being served right now in the warm light, around a common table, built on nothing more complicated than shared survival and the courage to stop running from the cold. If this story of unexpected family and silent strength resonated with you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what quiet act of kindness changed your life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories crafted for cinematic impact.